I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source, tracking President Trump's squeeze on higher education and the argument in the Ivy League whether or not to make a fight of it. First, Columbia surrendered under a Trump threat to cut $400 million in federal funding. Then Princeton said, no way, we'll fight your flimsy charges to the end. And then Harvard, with $9 billion at stake, tried gentle engagement with the Trump inquiry until 800 of its professors and staff said, no way, when free expression and democracy are at risk. What's required, they said, is open, coordinated resistance, which gives the rest of us time to learn what this fight is all about. Ryan Enos is a young professor in Harvard's government department. You're in the thick of it. You were among the first of the 800 signers of that petition, Ryan. What's the fight about, and where's it going?
Well, in many ways, I think we think this fight is just about whether or not professors can say things, whether or not people like myself have academic freedom, and we should definitely talk about that.
Or have a job even.
Absolutely. Some people's jobs are at risk, and there's, of course, risk for graduate students. There's risk for undergraduate students, and we've seen some of that already in this country. But in many ways, this fight is about something much larger than universities. What this fight is about is it's about democracy, and it's about an authoritarian attack on civil society. And universities are just part of that. What we see here is we see a pattern that we've seen over and over again. When authoritarians have tried to take power in countries, what they do is they attack the pillars of free thought in civil institutions.
Other countries.
Other countries, for example, Turkey or Hungary or Russia or Venezuela. The frightening thing is the autocrats that took power in those countries did exactly what we're seeing in the United States. They attack the press, they attack lawyers, and they attack universities. And this fits that pattern exactly. And so the people that are being targeted, of course, are people like me, but it's not about people like me. It's not about professors. It's about civil society and democracy.
Do we know why Alan Garber, the president of Harvard, gave in so uncomplaining, practically?
Yeah, well, I think that what Alan Garber is doing is making a mistake that a lot of people do, which is thinking that if they comply with what the autocrat demands, that they'll leave them alone. You know, this is kind of a classic collective action problem where if you just think, I'm going to just put my head down and hope that I get like a little bruise, maybe it'll move on to the next person. And if you've ever dealt with a schoolyard bully, which is very clearly the way Donald Trump is operating, you know that that is not the way these things work. They don't come back after you give them your lunch money once. They just keep coming back over and over.
Some say Mafia Don, too.
Oh, 100%. Well, that's the more serious example is that when a Mafia Don requires that you pay protection money, they don't take protection money only once. They keep coming back because the point is control. They want to control these institutions. They don't care about the money. They don't care about the pretext they've offered, which is about student safety or anti-Semitism or anything like that, which is clearly a pretext. They don't care about those things. What they care about is having control over free-thinking institutions in the United States, and they're going to keep coming back to them until they have complete control.
Trump and others, even here at Harvard, love to make a link with a fight on anti-Semitism. January 30th, just back in office, Trump signed an executive order to combat the explosion of anti-Semitism on campuses. Who confirms or denies that explosion? Or describes what forms that anti-Semitism takes? To me, that's the unanswered question.
This is a really important question and in many ways a really difficult one because, of course, measuring things, you just ask how it confirms the existence of an explosion. And that'd be a hard thing to do. And I say that as a
Geiger counter for
yeah, exactly. And I say that as a social scientist, right, you know, who actually studies these sort of things. Understanding how big a problem like anti-Semitism or racism or anything is a difficult thing to do. But I think that the place to start with this that we have to be absolutely clear about is Donald Trump does not give a hoot about anti-Semitism. If he actually cared about it, this is a guy...
He's befriended a few, too.
He's befriended a few anti-Semites. He's befriended a few people that give Nazi salutes.
You mean that guy with the chainsaw?
Yeah, the guy with the chainsaw, exactly. Elon Musk gives a Nazi salute and then goes to Germany to support the Alternative for Deutschland party, which is a party that talks about how the Nazis weren't so bad And Elon Musk, let's get over it. And Elon Musk gives him a speech that we have to move beyond our past, right? And Donald Trump elevates him in our national discourse and then is lecturing people about anti-Semitism. He does not care about anti-Semitism. But the thing to be clear on Harvard's campus too, and this is where I think that this national dialogue has really got out of control, in some ways for understandable reasons, because there was a understandable fear among the Jewish community in the United States after October 7th, 2023. But what happened was that manifested into something that just was distorted from reality. And if you look at Harvard's campus, and this is something I will stand by, anti-Semitism here is no more acute of a problem than in other institutions in the United States. And in many ways, it's probably less of a problem because this is a liberal place. The students here are almost militantly anti-prejudicial. I know these students. They are students that are committed to ending things like racism and anti-Semitism, and they are students that try to avoid that at all costs. And one of the problems that we see is we see a politicization of anti-Semitism for people trying to conflate that with criticisms of Israel. And once we separate criticisms of Israel from things like actual anti-Semitism that we should care about and try to remove from our society, then places like Harvard actually look like places that are examples of the way we should move rather than places we should condemn for politicized reasons.
This is where it gets really interesting and hard to map. Short-term Harvard president Claudine Gay, who was run out for being soft on anti-Semitism or something, she never asked her tormentors in Congress what they meant by anti-Semitism at Harvard. How do you feel, President Gay, about anti-Semitism at Harvard? And she never asked, what are you talking about? And then Larry Summers, former president of Harvard, also Jewish, keeps speaking about a crisis or something very serious in anti-Semitism at Harvard. But then yesterday, op-ed in the New York Times, he now worries about federal funding being withdrawn in any event. My first thought was, and others had it, Larry Summers is now trying to put out a fire that he started.
Yeah, I mean,
or is he?
I think a lot of us had that same reaction to that op-ed, and people have described that in different ways. I heard somebody say that Larry Summers created a golem and now he's trying to control it, is another way to think about that. And I think that Larry Summers, I admire that he said that in that op-ed, that, the federal government should back off. But I think he would do very well to also point out that he has been wrong to say there is a crisis of anti-Semitism at Harvard for so long.
Yeah, he said it over and over.
He said it over and over again. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that Larry Summers, and I think this is something that's consistent with his past statements, is he has trouble separating criticism of Israel, which is a legitimate and absolutely necessary thing for Americans to do in a democracy. We should be able to criticize what our government does, and our government funds Israel, and we should be able to criticize any country in the world. That's free speech. But he has trouble separating that from things that would be considered condemnable harassment of Jews. And I think Larry Summers is sort of behind the time of students and professors in that regard, just like these members of Congress are, except they're doing it for political reasons, because as we established, they don't actually care about anti-Semitism, or they wouldn't be supporting Donald Trump. What they care about is trying to attack universities and trying to attack students.
But Larry Summers ends up in the position fighting the pressure, the money pressure from the federal government. He ends up saying, in effect, that, yeah, there's a problem of anti-Semitism at Harvard, but not so serious as to warrant a penalty in federal funding. That's a real turn.
It is a real turn. And I think in many ways, we should stop saying that there is a anti-Semitism problem at Harvard. And I want to be very precise when I'm saying this. Of course, any type of bigotry or any type of prejudice is something that's a problem. And you'd be foolish to say it doesn't exist at Harvard, because of course types of prejudice and types of bigotry exist here. But we need to stop elevating this idea that there is acute anti-Semitism at Harvard as a reality, because I've seen no evidence, no compelling evidence, that it exists here more than in any other place, or that it is more acute than other types of bigotry. And in fact, I would argue that there's pretty compelling evidence, a reason to believe it's actually less in other places. So we see newspaper articles over and over again, for example, that say that the Trump administration is trying to attack universities because of the problem of anti-Semitism, for example. There was a subheader in a New York Times article just the other day that I was quoted in, And I actually wrote the journalist and I said, this is a bad subheader. And of course, he didn't write it. They never do. But I was saying, we got to stop doing this.
Remind me what it said.
It said that it was Trump's attempts to combat anti-Semitism at universities. And he's not trying to combat anti-Semitism any more than he's trying to combat any other type of prejudice. Donald Trump doesn't care about these things because there's not a problem. There's not an acute problem of anti-Semitism at universities. There might be acute problems of anti-Semitism other places in the world, but it's not at universities unless you make this fatal mistake of conflating criticism of Israel with actual anti-Semitism. And any well-meaning person can understand those are not the same thing.
As a practical, political, public opinion matter, how do you break that link between fighting the campuses, as Donald Trump would put it, as a fight on anti-Semitism? Nobody believes it that I know.
Right.
But how do you say it's a total phony?
That's a good question. I wish I knew the exact answer to this. I think one thing you've seen increasingly is that many people that have the absolute moral authority to say this, which are Jewish faculty and Jewish students at universities, have been standing up and saying this, that you're weaponizing something that should not be weaponized. And they're weaponizing something that is a real problem in the world, which is anti-Semitism, to use it as a cudgel to attack other things. And I think that's really valuable. I think the problem that we face, of course, is that other people find this a useful political tool, this idea that there's anti-Semitism out there run amok at places like Harvard. And the way I put this is it's an extremely dangerous and sad thing to do, because what you're doing when you're doing that is you're weaponizing the way that Americans abhor bigotry. Right? And we're not perfect about that. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of bigotry in the United States, but part of the national ideal of the United States is that we are a country that believes in equality. We reject racism. It's not to say we reject it holistically or 100% or we can ever even get rid of it, but this is part of our national conversation. We try to root out things like anti-Semitism and racism. And so when somebody says you have an anti-Semitism problem, that becomes a really hard thing to respond to, because we are a country that doesn't believe in those things and tries to root them out of our nation.
It could have helped for President Garber in saying that there's an anti-Semitism problem, that some Jewish students are afraid. That's enough to act on. But he never mentioned the woman, Rumeysa Ozturk, who got grabbed by ICE in front of her own house by plainclothes guys without any warning, any justification, any disputing of their claim. And next, she was gone. There's a real fear in this country, and President Garber could have broadened the indictment.
He could have, and I think that one of the things that is really unfortunate in the way this has been approached is we often implicitly are saying that the lives and the problems of one group of people matter more than another. And what I mean by that is, if a Jewish student at Harvard feels unsafe or if they feel discriminated against because of their Jewish identity, then that's an awful thing, and we should try to get rid of that. But we have made statements about that over and over and over again as a university, as a country. We have condemned that. And at the same time, you have students that very clearly, as you mentioned, are now being plucked off the street because of their Muslim identity. A year and a half ago at Harvard, there were students that merely for expressing that they had solidarity with Palestinian people who were occupied and bombed, they had their faces put on trucks and driven around Harvard Square in a way to publicly humiliate them. And the university didn't say a single thing about that. They could not bring themselves to condemn this public doxing of their Muslim students. And in that sense, when we elevate the problems of one group over another, we are sort of saying that the lives of one group of students or one group of Americans matters more than others, and we shouldn't be doing that.
Ryan, I've been hanging around the Harvard campus all my life in a certain way, but specifically in the last 10 days. And you have to notice that it's not easy being pro-Palestinian anywhere near Harvard. The undergraduate Palestine Solidarity Committee was put on probation this week, not for the peaceful and often very eloquent rally that they put on in the Yard on Tuesday, but the college said formally that the students hadn't got the required permission to use a microphone in their rally with 300 kids, or to co-sponsor the event with an unauthorized group called HOOP, Harvard Out of Occupied Palestine. I mean, the hammer came down swiftly, and these were good kids making good speeches, in fact. How do we recognize that in this picture?
Yeah. One thing you said, which I think is absolutely the case, and we need to recognize these are good kids. And these are kids that are here trying to do what college students have done in the United States almost all of our history, but especially the last half century, which is stand up for what they believe in, right? This is part of what young
Stand
people...
up is a big phrase.
Yeah, but it's what people do in the United States, right? Like college kids have been protesting for decades. One way a colleague described this to me is you saw these students being punished for something that they probably thought was part of the college experience. You know, there were students here coming up 40 years ago now that camped in Harvard Yard because they wanted to end apartheid in South Africa. Then there were kids that camped there because it was part of a living wage campaign. There are other ones that camped there as part of Occupy Wall Street. And you go back earlier in all of that, there were ones that camped there as part of the Vietnam War protests.
The kids the other day were going back to Martin Luther King Jr.
Sure.
and Selma.
Yeah.
And black rights, and there were a lot of black students in that group.
100%. We could describe this as a noble tradition in the United States because every one of those groups we just mentioned are ones we look back on now and we say they were on the right side of history. They were doing the right thing. And these students were following in their footsteps. They're doing the same thing. And what do we see? We see that these rules being enforced in a way that is very clearly pretextual, right? That the idea that you would grab away the
Pretextual meaning it's just a pretext.
It's just a pretext. The reason these students are being punished, they're getting their recognition by the university taken away because they had a microphone for a little speaker. I mean, that's absurd. That wasn't disruptive to anybody, right? You could call them in and you could say, I'm sorry, you shouldn't have had this little microphone on campus. Please don't do that again. And that would have been consistent with treating them as adults. It would have been consistent about the way we've treated every other group. It would have been the ethically right thing to do. But instead, they take away their entire right to organize. And the reason they're doing that, and I will climb up this hill and die on it because it's just so perfectly clear, is that they're doing that because they are trying to silence pro-Palestinian speech because the Trump administration is asking them to do that. There is no other reason they would do that. It is an example of this, what people have called this Palestinian exception to free speech, where other groups are allowed to exist, to occasionally violate a rule that nobody really cares about, but the hammer comes down on ones that are speaking about Palestine.
Yeah, there's another interesting instance of that this week at Harvard. The Center for Middle East Studies, which I've known for 40 years, and hugely important people like Nadav Safran, for example, in the past. But the center was decapitated, 2 directors dismissed without any official announcement or explanation. But those directors, one a Turk and then a Lebanese woman, serious scholars, but they'd been criticized for holding events at the center that didn't always and every event represent both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian divide. Last year, there was a report from the Harvard Jewish Alumni Alliance, an advocacy group, in May that accused that center of disproportionately focusing on the Israel-Palestine conflict relative to other regions or issues. Didn't even say it was imbalanced, but they want every event to have an internal balance about it. Something fishy.
Well, there is. And what I would encourage people to do when you're thinking about that is, I mean, first of all, we should step back and look at the broader issue, which is the Center for Middle Eastern Studies had its directors removed. There was a relationship at the public health school between the Harvard School of Public Health and Birzeit University in the West Bank, and all of a sudden that was suspended. At the Divinity School, a program of Palestine was suspended. At the same time, the Palestinian Undergraduate Solidarity Committee was suspended. It is not a coincidence that all these things happened at once. The university tells us it is, but that is simply not believable. If you believe that, then I have oceanfront property in Arizona to sell you, right? We don't see all these things about Palestine ended at once and it not have to do with a threat to academic freedom. The more specific issue is this idea that I think people should question about whether or not it makes sense for a program, an academic program, to say that you need to have perfect balance in its programming within a speaker series, right? And we don't
or in every book or in every lecture.
Exactly. For example, I am the director of what's known as the Center for American Political Studies here at Harvard. So we study American politics. And I should say, by the way, I worry about the fact that if somebody can complain about my center, that I could come in and lose my position or my center could get shut down. But at the same time, it would make zero sense to me that somebody would count up my talks and say, well, have you had the same number of Republicans that you have had Democrats? Have you had the same number of socialists that you've had Nazis or something like that? We don't look for balance across every partisan issue or every political divide. That's not what an academic center does. We focus on academic questions And we try to examine those within the field of the academic discipline that we have. And, this is actually something that's come up quite a bit recently regarding the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, is their current director, the acting director, while these other directors were fired by Harvard, he's a scholar of public health. So what he chose to focus on was issues of public health in the Middle East. And it so happens, when you're talking about public health in the Middle East, you're talking about like 9,000 children in Gaza losing their limbs. And you're talking about things like children being bombed in Lebanon. And you're talking about a genocide in the Sudan. And when you look at those things, it makes sense from a public health perspective that you're going to be focusing on these impoverished countries that are currently being attacked by other countries. It would be, of course, perfectly reasonable if you wanted to at some point to have a talk about public health in Israel, but that is simply not an acute issue like it is with public health in these other countries. And the only reason you would focus on that is if you thought there were political reasons to do it, not actual academic reasons.
In terms of university politics, who felt threatened by what the Center for Middle Eastern Studies was doing?
Well, of course, it's not clear because the university has not yet given a public explanation for why the Center for Middle Eastern Studies was essentially taken under receivership, why its leadership was removed. But my understanding, as far as I can tell, it wasn't a call that came broadly from people within the university. Of course, there's people within the university that would have been dissatisfied with their programming, but this is true of everywhere. We're a university with almost 30,000 people in our community. There's going to be people that don't like what other people are doing. But I think a lot of this was because of external pressure. And part of that is alumni that have been, yelling about the university on Twitter, former presidents that have been doing that, yelling about the university on Twitter and trying to sort of mobilize people in anger against it. And I think very clearly a lot of it is to try to appease the Trump administration. They made that almost direct demand of Columbia, was that Columbia's Middle Eastern Studies department be put under receivership. And this is the analog at Harvard. And so what it certainly looks like, and I would have to be convinced otherwise that this is not the case because the parallel is just too striking. It looks like Harvard is doing the same thing that Columbia did with their analogous department to try to keep the Trump administration from attacking Harvard. And that is what I would call anticipatory compliance.
The whole thing gets complicated. Ever since October 7th, and Larry Summers had a big part in it, there have been people calling on Harvard to comment on everything and condemn bad things in the world, which is an argument. I also wonder, though, if Harvard comments on one outrage, it's got to comment on all of them. This past week, there was a horrific report, best in The Guardian, actually, of outright murder of more than a handful of UN relief workers in Khan Yunis in Gaza, shot close up in the head and then buried in a mass grave with their vehicles in the sand and covered up. And it was one form of mass murder for politics in what is widely seen around the world as a genocidal crushing of the Palestinians, barely made the New York Times, and it hasn't been condemned on any campus that I know of. I mean, what should be the rule of these things?
Well, I think that what you're pointing to is this phenomenon, which we had spoken about earlier, where implicitly as a society, even though almost nobody would admit to this, is that we value some lives over others, right? And something I wrote to the Harvard leadership in the days after October 7th, 2023, was that it was striking that they were writing to condemn the attacks on Israel at the time, which should have been condemned, of course, the murder of over 1,000 people. And that was something that should have been condemned. But yet, in my time at Harvard, there had been thousands of Palestinians killed by the Israeli military and Israeli settlers. And never once had Harvard issued a statement about that. And so when you choose to issue a statement about one person's life or one group of 1,000 people's lives and not another, you're implicitly saying that those lives matter more than other lives. And there's no ethical position that a person can take that makes that correct. An Israeli child doesn't matter more than a Palestinian child. There's no way that a person can make that ethical claim unless they are a bigot, unless they think that their people matter more than somebody else's people. And so Harvard should not fall into that trap where it feels public pressure to make comments about one group of people because we think that their lives matter more than another. And yet we hear these kinds of pressures from people. There's good reason that people were horrified by October 7th. They wanted Harvard to say something. And in that sense, and this is something that, of course, my colleagues and I have discussed a lot, is that things like these policies of institutional neutrality make a lot of sense. Harvard should not be commenting on everything that happens, because eventually you're going to end up commenting on some things and not others. And that is going to be a way to just make people unhappy at the institution. It's going to be a way to find yourselves in an ethically compromised position where you're acting like some lives matter more than others. But at the same time, an institution then can't be handcuffed by that. They can't say, for an example, that when the institution is under threat, or when something that is fundamental to our country is under threat, like democracy, that we're going to remain quiet. And something I fear is that the institution has used this policy of institutional neutrality, which again is something that I support, to then say that we cannot speak out now when there is clearly an authoritarian assault on our country. Because that's not neutrality when you're doing that. What you're doing in that point is you're abdicating your position. You're abdicating your responsibility to society. And this is also true when students are being picked up off the street for things they say in a college newspaper. If students can't speak up at Tufts, then they can't speak up at Harvard. And then we no longer become an intellectually vibrant place. If you are not speaking out when Columbia is being attacked, when another university is being attacked, what it means is it means people at Harvard are going to silence themselves. And at that point, it's a fundamental attack on the mission of the university, on the way we do things. And it is then the case that if Harvard does not speak out, that they're abdicating their responsibility to other universities and to society.
Fear has everything to do with it, but it's hard to put your finger on. Where do you feel it here?
It's a striking thing to say, but in many ways, we feel fear across Harvard now. And I want to think about that statement for just a second. The fact that at an American university in the United States, in this country that we talk so often about being free, that people are in a state of fear in an institution of higher education. When I talk to colleagues and students that are international students that are not here as American citizens, they often talk that they are afraid to speak out. When I talk to other colleagues, we don't send emails back and forth now because we are afraid that those will end up being subpoenaed by Congress or the Trump administration. We speak over encrypted messaging apps.
Tenured professors.
Tenured professors, because we're afraid that our speech will be used against us. And think about that. So in the United States of America, tenured professors are censoring their speech not just publicly, but to each other because they're afraid that will be used against them. And at that point, when we're already in that situation, we are no longer living in the free country we once did. And we've moved beyond this idea that we are preventing something like an attack on our democracy. Our democracy is already under attack. We are already living in a state of fear. I write publicly about this a lot, and I hear from my friends and my family, they say, be careful. And that is a shocking thing to say in the United States, where people are telling you to be careful for criticizing the government. I mean, that is something that has been a fundamental part of the United States since day one. The founders wrote this into the Constitution because they knew it was so crucial to a democracy. And the fact that we even have to think about being afraid of criticizing the government says that we are now in a very, very bad place that we desperately need to get ourselves out of.
Come back to President Garber's decision to engage with the Trump administration. Turns out he was there last week and, offering every way to cooperate with their inquiry. How did he come to that? And is he affected now by this uproar from 800 signers of a petition saying, wrong step entirely?
I hope he's affected by it, because one thing to be clear is it's not only the 800 faculty that signed this petition. It's not only us. It's, alumni that are up in arms. There's been, at this point, thousands of alumni that have signed letters. It's students that are up in arms. And I think all of them are saying that you need to oppose this. And if one is not opposing the Trump administration, then they're saying they have wisdom that all these thousands of alumni and faculty and students don't have. And that takes a certain amount of confidence in your own decision-making to say that. But I think that the mistake that people make when they think you can engage with the Trump administration is a belief that Washington still operates like it once did. I think this in many ways is the same mistake that the Harvard Corporation is making, where there's people on the Harvard Corporation, the Harvard governing body, that have been powerful movers and shakers in the United States and in Washington for a long time. And they think, well, if we just engage, the rules will show that we're in the right. And Harvard is in the right. The things that the Trump administration are doing are illegal. But we don't live in a world currently where the rules apply. We're living in a world where there is an attempt at an authoritarian takeover our democracy, and we don't live in a rules-based order. We live in a power-based order. And simply going to somebody and saying, let's talk about this as reasonable adults or something, is not going to make things happen. Harvard needs to resist. It needs to resist in the courts. It needs to resist in the court of public opinion. It needs to push back against these things with strength, because what the Trump administration is trying to do is not something that fits within the old way of doing things.
Your colleague in the government department here, Stephen Levitsky, says that we've already lost our full-throated American democracy. He says we're well down the road to what he calls competitive authoritarianism, meaning that we still go through the motions, so to speak, of elections and things like that, voting, but we don't have robust debates. The government does not print the news exactly, but the commercial media print the government line day after day after day. What do we do about this? And I'm late in recognizing that this is all about, are we going to be a free country?
It is all about we're going to be a free country. And I know that is a startling thing to say. A couple years ago, if somebody would have said that, they would have been treated as some kind of a crank, right? And they would have said, this is the United States. What do you mean? But what we're seeing here is exactly what has happened in other countries that have lost their democracy. And I think one of the reasons it is hard for people to recognize is because the model we have in our head when we think about an end of democracy is we have this idea of thinking about Nazi Germany or something like that, where we expect to see people goose-stepping down Pennsylvania Avenue or something. But that's not the way modern democracies die. They die where there's still a shell of democracy, where we're still going to have elections, and we'll probably have a federal election in 2026.
Trump did win an electoral college and a popular majority.
He was a legitimately elected president of the United States. Viktor Orban was a legitimately elected president of Hungary. The first time he got in there, Vladimir Putin was more or less legitimately elected in Russia. But what happens is from within, these leaders then take apart the things that make elections free and fair. They suppress the press. They take apart institutions that are allowed to have dissent. They tilt the playing field against people that can run against them. They sometimes even use implicit threats of violence against people to silence them. For example, we've seen this in the United States already, which is a shocking thing to say, that there's the specter of violence hanging over our elections. But Trump pardoned 1,600 people that were convicted or in the process of being convicted of trying to violently overthrow the government of the United States. And when you read news reports of members of Congress that have considered voting against Trump, for example, voting against his nominees for these cabinet secretaries, voting against people that are manifestly unqualified, like Pete Hegseth and other people, Kai Patel, lots of people that just are not qualified for those positions. The news reports have said that senators that have considered voting against him did not do so because they were afraid for their own safety. They were afraid they would be attacked violently by people aligned with Donald Trump. That is a shocking thing to say in the United States, but it is a sign when our elected representatives can no longer cast the vote they want to vote because they're afraid of violence, that we're no longer in a full democracy. And if you want to take things full circle, the other place that happens is when autocratic leaders, when they try to suppress dissent at places like universities. They try to say, we're going to keep those students from protesting. We're going to keep those professors from writing nasty op-eds about us. We're going to try to take away that ability from universities to push back. And that's exactly what's happening in the United States.
Come back to the Harvard place in this fight. Universities and their presidents, for that matter. Michael Roth at Wesleyan University is suddenly a hero for being very outspoken and believing in it, that the universities have got to get together. They've got to have a plan. They've got to be organized. They've got to be united in a fashion. To my mind, it comes back to President Garber at Harvard and that list of 800. The 800 said to me, there's a vote of no confidence waiting to be taken. And it's been done. Larry Summers lost a vote of no confidence in his own faculty. And who knows the resentments he's carried out of his whole experience. But it could happen here again. What if Harvard were designated or designated itself as not only the oldest and richest school in this country, the most famous byword for higher education in the world, and said, somebody's got to stand up. Larry Summers said, if Harvard doesn't stand up, who in the hell can stand up? What does that prospect look like to you? And would not Alan Garber have to renounce his peacemaking with the Trump administration?
I think that Alan Garber, this is true of a leader in any university, but Alan Garber in particular, for the reasons you said, because he's the president of Harvard, that he's the president of the oldest and most prestigious university in the United States, a place that in many ways has a duty to stand up for America because it has benefited so much from America.
More presidents of the United States, as Larry Summers said, more Supreme Court justices, more Nobel Prize winners probably.
Yes. It's a place that is a central institution to the United States and therefore has what I would argue is a moral responsibility to stand up for civil society, not only for other universities, but for civil society. I think this is clear. If these leaders in civil society do not stand up, if the places that have the means and the prestige to do so, then how do we expect other places to do that? If I were Alan Garber, and I don't envy him, don't get me wrong, I would not want to be in that position because I understand it's a very tough position to be in. But if I were that position, I would ask myself, do I want to look back one day and say, when my country was under attack, and that's what's happening, the democracy in his country is under attack, when my university was under attack, did I stand up and do the right thing? And I think he's hearing a lot of pressure not to do that from maybe people that don't care or think the right thing to do is to keep your head down. But I think if he listens to his faculty, if he listens to these students, if he listens to the alumni that see Harvard this way, then he'll stand up and do the right thing, and I hope he does.
First of all, who does he consult? Who tells the president of Harvard time to cut your losses or time to start a fight or get out of the game or...
Yeah, it's not entirely clear. I don't know if you read these reports on, for example, the Harvard Corporation, which is the ultimate governing body of Harvard, but it's often described as secretive.
No, they don't send me a copy.
No, it's even sometimes sort of hard to track down who exactly their membership is. It's often described as a secretive body, which is a funny way to describe a governing body. But it's what they do is often a mystery. They meet in secret. They conduct their business in secret. And so they're the ultimate decision makers at Harvard. And Alan Garber is talking to them. Then it's not clear what kind of input the rest of us have. But I think that who he should be consulting, one of the advantages that a place like Harvard has is there are a lot of really smart and energetic and talented people here, right? I mean, this is, a place that's full of thousands of faculty that are supposedly among the best in the world at what they do. Many of them are accomplished public servants. They've been in places like Congress. They have been mayors of cities. Some of them are the leading physicians in the world in their field. They are people that know how to handle these things. And they're people that see both the moral and the strategic imperative of fighting back against the Trump administration. That's who Alan Garber should be listening to.
The question is still, what could he do? What could those gifted people do? They're threatened with losing $9 billion, it says. They've also got an endowment of $50 billion. And Larry Summers sort of says that's what endowments are for, get you through bad days or bad seasons like this. What might he do in terms of announcing a coalition of university presidents, for example, public and private or whatever, or legal remedies or publicity campaigns or national tours or you name it?
Yep. So in this letter you've mentioned, actually, that over 800 faculty signed, when we sent this letter to Alan Garber and to the corporation, we asked them to do three things. And the first one we said is just to publicly condemn these attacks on higher education and on academic freedom. And that seems like a very easy thing to do. But it's important because one thing we know, and this is getting into the social science of things, is that public opinion is shaped by what people say. What people think about a situation is shaped by the different streams of information they hear coming from the news and from their politicians and everybody else. And right now, all they hear, essentially, is Donald Trump saying Harvard is a bad place, Columbia is a bad place, these other universities
That's
are
not all they hear. I mean, they also hear that the stock market is in turmoil.
Yes. So they hear a lot of other things, but about universities, they're hearing that one message. And what these university presidents need to do is stand up and say, this is an attack on universities, it's an attack on democracy, and it's illegal. And if people start to hear that message, that will help counter that. And public opinion matters in these things. That will give Congress an opportunity to push back. It will make Donald Trump question what he's doing. So that is number one. Number two is they should legally contest these things. Part of that $50 billion endowment that you're talking about funds a lot of lawyers that right now should be saying, we're going to use these legal funds to go attack this in court. Because every lawyer I've talked to, and Harvard has some pretty good ones in the law school that I know well, they say these are illegal. What Donald Trump is doing are not allowed by law. And if you read the coverage on Columbia said that they were considering legally contesting these things, but they decided it'd be too expensive. And they just couldn't do it because the federal government, of course, has a whole army of lawyers too. But Harvard should be doing that. They should be calling on its resources to contest these things with this giant endowment it has. And they should also be just saying they're going to refuse to comply with these things. They should say straight up, these are illegal, and we will see you in court about this. The last thing we said they should do is they should be reaching out to other universities to saying that we are going to form mutual defense. We will speak out against attacks on other universities, and that Harvard should be calling on its alumni to mobilize in favor of Harvard. These Supreme Court justices, these members of Congress, these people, there are thousands of people that have an interest in Harvard's survival, but not only Harvard, there are millions of Americans that want higher education to survive like it is. And they need somebody to say, you all should stand up, you should call your representative, you should go to protest, you should do what you can do to say that these attacks on higher education are attacks on an essential part of the American economy and are attacks on our democratic system itself.
What if Donald Trump has figured out the anti-intellectual strain in American life and American history? And what if he's betting on a campaign against not just Harvard, but the whole picture of an elite-making machine called Harvard, a very unequal society in which Harvard rules the haves?
Right. I think that is a powerful and in many ways a not entirely unjustified attack on places like Harvard, right? There's no doubt that Harvard is an elitist institution. And that sort of anti-elite rhetoric is something that has been a powerful undercurrent of American society for a long time. And, in many ways, I get it. I didn't go to Harvard. It wasn't even in my mind growing up. I didn't even really think it was a place that I even thought about or barely knew existed, right? And so I understand why it seems like a place that people shouldn't care about, or maybe even a place that people should resent because it is elitist. That's almost part of its inherent nature. But I think that what needs to be said is that it's not just about Harvard. It is about attacking higher education more generally, and Harvard is just the clearest target in that. When Viktor Orban in Hungary attacked higher education in Hungary, he didn't just attack one university, he attacked them all. Same thing in Turkey. When Erdogan attacked universities in Turkey, he didn't just attack one university, he attacked them all. And they're starting with Harvard, but even since the time this attack on Harvard was announced, they moved to Princeton, they moved to Brown. Donald Trump announced that he was going to try to cut funding from K through 12 school districts unless they complied with his orders. And what he's doing is he's attacking these foundations of civil society more largely. And so I think somebody could not give a hoot about Harvard, and that'd be a fine thing to say. I mean, I wouldn't even argue with him about that. But what I would implore people to think about is this is not about Harvard. This is about education. This is about free thought. And I think that is a winning message for Americans, that this is part of what makes America great, if you want to use that rhetoric, is the fact that America is a place where people can get educated. America is a place where we have a strong economy built on that system of education. And most importantly, America is a place where the government does not regulate people's speech. And you cannot care about Harvard, you cannot care about Princeton, you cannot care about Columbia, and I know most people don't, that we should really draw the line in the government doing things like attacking free speech.
Against the anti-intellectual push, I mean, how do you do justice to the pluralistic, divided, balanced powers of the United States, a very spread out country used to, traditionally at least, to much more open conversation, more church voices, more Congress voices, for example? Where do we hear? I mean, my suspicion is that Trump is against all rival institutions and sees all institutions as rivals. There's a way there to fight back, I think.
There absolutely is. And I think one of the ways to think about what makes America different than all these places I've been mentioning, like Hungary and Turkey and Russia, is that America has a very thick and rich and robust civil society, right? And it's spread out in a diffuse way.
Exactly.
There's obviously not just Harvard. There are 6,000 universities in the United States. And those universities are in small towns, they're in big cities, these are colleges and universities. They're in the Midwest, they're in the West, they're in the East, they're in the South, they're everywhere. They're part of countless communities in the United States that are involved in these, right? And people have an interest in those. But it's not just these universities, it's the churches where people go and they organize and they speak about what's important to them. It is the chambers of commerce. It's the law firms. It is the civic institutions, like these things that we forget about sometimes, but are still very important, like the Rotary clubs and the Elks and the Masons and all these things. These are the backbone of civil society in the United States. And fortunately, even with something as powerful as the federal government in the United States, it's impossible to attack all of those, to shut them all down at once. And they all have the power of a voice. They can all speak out. They can all organize. But the thing that we have to understand about this is Donald Trump doesn't intend to do that. He doesn't, he can't pull money from the local PTA. Maybe he can try, but, he can't pull money from the Chamber of Commerce in, every city in the United States when they criticize things like his crazy tariffs or something like that. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to scare people into self-censoring. That's what autocrats do. The reason he's picking students up off the street for op-eds they write in newspapers is not because he thinks he can actually directly silence every student that writes an oppositional op-ed. He wants them to silence themselves. That's the way autocrats work. And that's the reason we have to resist every time this happens, because otherwise we end up censoring ourselves.
Ryan, you were instrumental in organizing the 800 faculty people on that Say No, Stand Up list, and the 3 points of sort of condemn, challenge legally, and then unite. What next? Really? What is that impressive body going to do next week?
It's a good question, and we don't quite know yet. But I'll tell you, just before I came to talk to you, I was in a room with about 50 faculty members from all over the university, from FAS, from the medical school, from the divinity school, from everywhere, the ed school. These are people I almost never see, right? And they were people that were united there actually in a meeting of the American Association of University Professors. We're filling the room and talking about what to do next. And I think that one thing that has happened because of what's going on, because Harvard's under attack, is faculty are uniting and organizing in a way that we haven't seen before. And in many ways, there's something very powerful about that. We didn't know we needed to organize. We weren't under that kind of threat. But faculty at a place like Harvard, we don't only have our voices, we don't only have the ability to persuade, but we have other things we can do. We have things like our labor. We teach the classes here. We man the committees. We do those things. And we are prepared, I think many of us are prepared to say we are going to use those resources we have to compel the university to do the right thing. And people are talking about that. We can't just give up, lay down, and let Donald Trump run over democracy and academic freedom in the United States. And if our voices won't work, then we need to think about how we're going to use our bodies and our labor to make these things happen.
Are you ready to see Harvard and let Harvard be seen as the standard bearer in the fight for democracy?
I mean, I absolutely am. I think it is incumbent upon Harvard to be one of these standard bearers. It can't be the only one, but if leading institutions don't stand up, then democracy in the United States will die. That is a historical pattern. And I do not want to work at an institution that won't stand up and do the right thing in this fight.
That's a manifesto, and an impressive one. We wish you well. Let me just say, as one who never imagined that this democracy could die, I'm listening now, I'm watching carefully, and I'm impressed by what you're doing. Thank you, Ryan Enos.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Ryan Enos is a professor of government at Harvard. He was among the first of 800 faculty members to petition the university for a united resistance against the threat of unfunding higher education. Here at Open Source, we count on our listeners to support our work. If you haven't done your part yet, now's the time. Go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest-running podcast going strong. We're proud to be part of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent, creator-owned podcasts. Our shows range from history to politics to art to technology. We come together around the principle that independent voices and independently funded media are more important than ever. You can learn more at hubspokeaudio.org. And thank you